May 1980. Island Park, Long Island, New York. 6 a.m. Federal agents surround a quiet suburban house. No sirens, no warning shots, just the sound of a door being forced open. Inside, a woman moves fast. She grabs a plastic bag of white powder, $60,000 of cocaine, and runs for the bathroom. She flushes it before the agents reach the top of the stairs. By the time the search is over, the house is empty of evidence. But it doesn't matter. The man they came for is already finished. This looks like a mob hit gone wrong. It isn't. There is no rival gunman, no Cadillac trunk, no body in a landfill. The truth is worse, in its own quiet way. The people destroying this family are not enemies. They are the government and each other. Because behind the polished image of wise guys in tailored suits, behind the restaurant tables and the FBI files later obsessed over by an entire generation, there was a second business. One the bosses never approved. One built by a low-level associate and his wife, in secret, against orders that carried a death sentence for disobedience. This is not the story Hollywood told. This is the story of the empire hidden inside Goodfellas and the FBI files that proved it was real. Henry Hill was born in 1943 in Brooklyn, half Irish, half Sicilian, a bloodline that should have locked him out of the Italian mob for life. In most crews, a man without full Sicilian blood could rise only so far. Made men required pure lineage. Henry would spend his entire career one step outside the inner circle, useful but never fully trusted. He grew up across the street from a cab stand that doubled as a front for the Lucchese crime family. At 11 years old, he was running errands for men twice his age, learning that a folded $20 bill bought more respect than an honest week's wage. By 13, he had stopped going to school. By 16, he belonged to the street more than his own household. Karen Friedman came from a different world entirely. Jewish, suburban, raised on Long Island in a home that valued stability over spectacle. She met Henry in 1965 on a double date arranged by Paul Vario's son. Henry stood her up the first time. She almost walked away. She didn't. What drew her in was not naivety, it was proximity to power. Henry moved through restaurants like he owned them. Waiters vanished tables for him. Police looked the other way. For a young woman raised on rules, that kind of immunity looked like freedom. Neither of them understood yet what they were building a life inside. Henry saw the crew as a family that paid better than any legitimate job ever could. Karen saw a husband who made problems disappear. Both of them were about to learn what that protection actually cost, and who really held the power to take it away. By the late 1960s, Henry Hill was no longer running errands. He was earning. Under Paul Vario, a capo in the Lucchese family, Henry learned the architecture of the underworld, not violence first, but structure. Every dollar made on the street owed a percentage upward. Every favor granted came with a debt attached. Vario didn't need to raise his voice. His silence carried more weight than another man's threats. Henry worked alongside Jimmy Burke, a hijacker with a reputation for efficiency and a body count that stayed quiet for decades. Burke ran crews that stole cargo out of Kennedy Airport cigarettes, liquor electronics product that moved through fences before the manifests were even filed as missing. It was profitable. It was organized. And crucially, it was tolerated by the family. Because hijacking didn't attract the kind of federal attention that other rackets did. This was the hierarchy Henry lived inside. At the top, the boss, insulated by layers of soldiers and capos. Beneath him, men like Vario, who controlled territory and collected tribute. Beneath Vario, associates like Henry never made. Never full members, but essential enough to be protected as long as they generated money and caused no exposure. The 1978 Lufthansa heist became Henry's signature achievement, nearly $6 million in cash and jewelry, stolen from a JFK airport vault, at the time the largest cash robbery in American history. It should have been the high point of his career. Instead, it planted the first seed of his destruction. Burke, paranoid that the crew would talk, began systematically murdering the men involved. One by one, the participants disappeared. Henry watched his own circle shrink, and he understood, perhaps for the first time, that loyalty inside this world was never permanent. It was leverage, and leverage expired the moment you became a liability. Henry was becoming a bigger earner than ever. He was also becoming expendable. Paul Vario's rule was simple and absolute: no narcotics. Drug trafficking carried federal mandatory sentences that made men talk, and men who talked destroyed families. Vario had survived decades in the underworld by keeping his crew away from exactly the kind of charge that could unravel everything. He said it plainly, more than once. Anyone caught dealing would answer for it with their life, if necessary. Henry Hill heard the warning. He ignored it. By the late 1970s, cash from hijacking and gambling was no longer enough to sustain the lifestyle Henry had built: the restaurants, the properties, the constant flow of money that kept his crew loyal and his household comfortable. Cocaine offered a margin nothing else could match. A kilogram bought for a few $1,000s could be broken down and sold for many times that on the street. Karen was not a passive witness to this decision. She understood what her husband was building, and she began participating directly, holding product, managing cash, learning the mechanics of a business that operated entirely outside the family's sanctioned rackets. This is the turning point that defines the entire case. Henry wasn't simply breaking a rule. He was constructing a second hidden hierarchy inside the first one, where his real bosses were customers and suppliers. Not Vario, not the Lucchese family. Every kilogram moved was a quiet act of rebellion against the very structure that had raised him. For a while, it worked. The money multiplied. Nobody above him seemed to notice, or those who noticed said nothing, protecting their own cut of an operation that officially did not exist. But secrecy inside organized crime is never permanent. It survives only as long as no one has a reason to expose it, and reasons in this world always eventually arrive. Henry Hill had crossed a line his own family considered unforgivable. He had also, without knowing it, placed himself squarely in the crosshairs of an entirely different enemy, one with far more resources than Paul Vario. To understand why Henry Hill's cocaine business became a federal priority, it helps to understand what was happening in Washington at the same time. Through the 1970s, the American government had declared narcotics its central law enforcement target. Nixon's administration had already named drug abuse public enemy number one, funneling new resources into the Drug Enforcement Administration, an agency created in 1973 specifically to consolidate the fight against trafficking. By the time Henry was moving product out of Long Island kitchens, the DEA was no longer a fledgling office. It was an aggressive, well-funded machine with wiretap authority and a mandate to dismantle networks, not just arrest street dealers. At the same moment, prosecutors were discovering a new weapon against organized crime itself: the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Passed in 1970, but only beginning to show its full power a decade later. RICO didn't require the government to catch a boss pulling a trigger. It allowed prosecutors to charge an entire criminal enterprise as a single conspiracy, using the actions of low-level associates to build cases against the men at the top, who had spent careers staying legally untouchable. This convergence was catastrophic for men like Henry. Traditional mob rackets, gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, had always carried a kind of institutional tolerance. Local police took payoffs. Judges had relationships. Narcotics changed the calculation entirely. Drug cases triggered federal jurisdiction, and federal jurisdiction meant agencies immune to the local corruption that had protected men like Vario for 30 years. Henry Hill was not just violating his capo's order. He was operating exactly the kind of enterprise that the federal government, at that specific political moment, was assembling its most powerful legal tools to destroy. The mob's old defense silence, corruption, fear meant nothing against wiretaps, informants, and a prosecutor's ability to charge an entire family as one criminal organization. Henry didn't know it yet, but the walls closing in on him weren't only made of made men and capos. They were built in courtrooms and legislative sessions, years before his name ever appeared on a federal file. The empire he built in secret was about to collide with an empire built in Washington, and only one of them was going to survive the encounter. By 1979, the crew that once felt like family had become a minefield. Jimmy Burke's paranoia after the Lufthansa heist had already claimed a string of lives. Men who had helped pull off the biggest cash robbery in American history were turning up dead, one after another, for the crime of simply knowing too much. Henry watched friends disappear and understood the arithmetic. Usefulness and survival were not the same thing. Tommy DeSimone, a volatile enforcer inside the crew, had attempted to assault Karen while Henry was imprisoned on an earlier charge. Karen, isolated and unprotected, turned during that period to Paul Vario himself, a relationship that deepened the fractures inside a family already held together by convenience rather than trust. When Vario later learned of DeSimone's other unauthorized killings, he moved to have DeSimone eliminated. The internal violence wasn't cleaning the organization. It was hollowing it out from within. Henry's own position grew more precarious by the month. He was earning heavily from narcotics, money that made him valuable. But that same business was the one thing capable of bringing federal heat down on everyone above him. He had become both an asset and a landmine protected only as long as his activities stayed hidden, and disposable the instant they didn't. The public image of loyalty inside the family, the toasts, the respect, the language of brotherhood masked a private reality built entirely on self-interest. Every man in the crew was calculating his own exposure. Every act of apparent friendship carried a silent question. What does this cost me if it goes wrong? Henry began to sense, correctly, that he was surrounded not by protection, but by potential executioners. If the drug operation surfaced, Vario's rule made the response almost automatic. And if federal agents ever built a case against him, his own bosses would see him as a liability worth silencing before he could become a witness. He was trapped between two forces, each with a motive to end him, and neither one bound by mercy. May 1980. The house in Island Park. The morning the cold open began. By this point, federal agents had been building their case for months, using wiretaps and informants to trace the narcotics network Henry had spent years constructing outside his family's sanctioned rackets. The DEA didn't need a confession. They had surveillance, intercepted calls, and enough documented transactions to bring charges that would carry decades in federal prison. When the agents broke through the door that morning, Karen moved on instinct. She grabbed $60,000 of cocaine and ran for the bathroom, flushing the evidence before it could be seized. It was a desperate, almost theatrical act of loyalty, the kind of split-second decision that revealed exactly how deep her involvement had become. She was not a bystander watching her husband's crimes from a safe distance. She was inside the operation, protecting it with her own hands even as agents filled the house around her. The gesture didn't matter. The government already had what it needed. Henry was arrested and charged with narcotics trafficking, a case strong enough to guarantee a lengthy sentence. This was the true execution, not a bullet in an alley, but a legal machine closing with total precision. No negotiation, no corrupted officer to bribe, no local judge with a debt to call in. The federal system that had been assembled over the previous decade, the RICO statutes and DEA task forces built specifically to dismantle organizations like this one, had finally reached the men it was designed to catch. And now Henry faced the second threat, the one running parallel to his legal exposure. Jimmy Burke had already demonstrated, repeatedly, what happened to men who became liabilities. Paul Vario's rule against narcotics was not a suggestion, and Henry had violated it for years. While building a fortune his own capo never approved. If word spread that Henry might cooperate with federal prosecutors to reduce his sentence, the men who had once called him family would have every reason to make certain he never took the stand. Henry understood with total clarity that he had run out of protected space. The mob would kill him for talking. The government would bury him for staying silent. There was no version of loyalty left that could keep him alive. He made his choice within weeks. He agreed to testify. The wise guy who had spent his entire life building an empire in the chateau of men he could never fully belong to, now held the single most valuable asset left to him, the power to destroy them first. Henry Hill's cooperation detonated the organization from the inside. His testimony became the foundation for convictions against more than 50 people, including Paul Vario, the very capo whose rule he had defied, and Jimmy Burke, the man responsible for the string of murders following the Lufthansa heist. The empire that had operated for decades under the protection of silence and corrupted local officials collapsed under the weight of a single associate's decision to talk. In 1980, Henry, Karen, and their 2 children entered the Witness Protection Program, surrendering their names, their history, and any remaining connection to the life they had built. For a family that once measured status by restaurant tables and untouchable authority, the new existence was defined by anonymity and constant relocation. The government that had destroyed Henry's freedom now controlled what remained of it. The protection didn't hold. In 1987, Henry was convicted again, this time for drug trafficking in Seattle, a violation that got him expelled from witness protection entirely. The very crime that had triggered his downfall in 1980 resurfaced 7 years later, proving that whatever pulled him toward narcotics ran deeper than circumstance. He could change his name, his city, his entire legal identity. He could not change the pattern that had built, and then destroyed his first life. Karen's story unfolded on a slower, quieter timeline. She had entered protection as a partner in the operation, not a passive spouse, and the toll of that involvement outlasted the marriage itself. In 1990, she filed for divorce, a process that took 12 years to finalize completely. The woman who had once flushed evidence to protect her husband eventually chose to separate her identity from his entirely. What remained was not vindication for either of them. Vario and Burke died in prison, their decades of accumulated power reduced to conviction records and federal case files. Henry spent the rest of his life moving between minor legal troubles and a strange, uneasy fame. His story eventually reaching millions through a film that turned his betrayal into entertainment. The organization he had helped dismantle never fully recovered its old structure. The federal tools built specifically to destroy operations like his RICO, wiretap surveillance, the full weight of a government determined to win the drug war had proven exactly as effective as intended. Every criminal organization sells the same promise: loyalty above law, family above self. Henry Hill's story proves how quickly that promise dissolves the moment self-interest enters the room. Vario feared exposure. Burke feared witnesses. Henry feared prison. Karen feared losing everything at once. None of them were protecting each other. They were protecting themselves, using the language of brotherhood to disguise it. This is the quiet thesis inside every Mafia collapse. The hierarchy isn't loyalty, it's leverage, held together only as long as everyone's silence serves everyone's interest simultaneously. Return once more to that bathroom in Island Park. Karen flushing cocaine down the drain, seconds ahead of federal agents. She believed she was saving something. She wasn't. The water had already decided what would survive and what wouldn't, and so, in the end, had everyone else in that house.